Arthur Sulzberger, former chairman of the New York Times, his son now holds the position. The newspaper has been owned and operated by the Osh-Sulzberger family for 5 generations. Anna Wintour, editor-in-chief of Vogue, the iconic Devil Wears Prada, Nelson Rockefeller, grandson of America's first billionaire J.D. Rockefeller, and former U.S. Vice President Henry Kissinger, perhaps the most well-regarded U.S. Secretary of State in China's eyes, and the Pritzker family, of which John Pritzker, second-generation heir, founded the Pritzker Architecture Prize and the Hat Hotel Group. When these names appear together on the board of directors of a single organization, you know there is a far more to the history than meets the eye. Before the American Civil War, the majority of wealthy Americans were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, traditional elites whose families had prospered for generations, like their European ancestors. They formed tight-knit social circles centered around so-called refined pastimes, classical music, Shakespearean plays, Italian operas, and the like. To gain entry into these circles, and note money pedigree was the ultimate. After the Civil War, the Second Industrial Revolution propelled America to the Gilded Age, a period of explosive economic growth that spawned a legend of self-made industrial tycoons. These new money elites clashed sharply with the old guard. The old money looked down on the new tycoons' vulgarity and nouveau-rich swagger. The new money scored the old guard's stuffy conservation, obsession with pedigree, and what they saw as paltry fortunes in comparison to their own. Rejected by the old money establishment, the new tycoons lost interest in courting their favor and set out to build their own institutions. The Metropolitan Opera, Carnegie Hall, these were all founded by new money elites during this era, quickly displacing the old money cultural organizations that had come before. Though lacking the old guard's bloodlines, those self-made magnates amassed wealth, especially liquid capital, at a pace unheard of in industrial age, far surpassing that of the old money families. They then turned their attention to an even more costly pursuit, connecting art and antiquities. With Europe mired in economic depression, countless masterpieces were sold off to American buyers, sparking a museum building boom across the United States. On July 4, 1866, in a restaurant on the outskirts of northwest Paris, a group of Americans gathered to celebrate Independence Day. Leading the festivities was John Jay, a prominent lawyer and one of the founding members of the Republican Party. He delivered a speech titled America's Invasion of the Old World, in which he argued that the United States needed an art museum, a public institution dedicated to enriching the nation's aesthetic and artistic education. Unlike European countries, which had built their museum connections in large part through colonial plunder, the United States itself has been a colony. Thus, its museums could not rely on stolen colonial treasures as their European counterparts had. Compounding this, the indigenous Native American cultures of the US were viewed with disdain and targeted for eradication by these European descended elites. As a result, the primary sources of connections for most American museums were purchases or donations from private collectors. Upon returning to New York, John Jay rallied his elite social circles to form a board of directors, raise funds, and search for artifacts to fill the fledgling museum's halls. Luigi Palma di Cesnola was born into a minor Italian noble family. He fought in both the Italian War of Independence before the Crimean War before emigrating to New York at the age of 25, where he later served in the Civil War and attained the rank of colonel. After the war, following assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Cesnola began to spread a tall tale. He claimed to have been personally received by Lincoln, who had recommended him for a general's commission. From that point on, he referred to himself in the press as General Cesnola. He also inflated his noble Italian title, transforming his nominal, low-ranking baronetcy into a far more prestigious earldom. Subsequently, through the lobbying of two senators' friends, Cesnola secured a position as U.S. consul to Cyprus, a territory then under Ottoman rule. During his tenure as consul, he added another title to his resume, archaeologist. In reality, he was little more than an amateur enthusiast, exploiting his diplomatic status to flout local regulations. he launched a series of unauthorized excavations around Cyprus' most famous archaeological site, the ancient city of Kurin. Later generations of archaeologists, sifting through the artifacts and records Cesnola left behind, were stunned by his sheer amateurism. He kept no excavation journals, recorded no detail about where or when artifacts were unearthed, and showed utter disregard for the preservation of the relics or respect for the local culture. Over his 12 years in office, he looted more than 35,000 artifacts from the Korean side. Some he sold directly to tourists for cash. Others he shipped to London's black market for antiquities. Still others he gifted to politicians he hoped would advance his career. In March 1870, the Ottoman government in Constantinople, itself in the process of establishing a museum, learned of Cesnola's plundering and issued an order to seize all items being shipped out of Cyprus by the U.S. consulate. Enraged by the news, Cesnola threatened to demand the U.S. government send warship to retrieve his loot. At the same time, he leveraged his connections to smuggle the remaining 10,000 plus artifacts to London under the guise of the Russian embassy. He attempted to sell the entire collection in one bulk purchases to three of Europe's most prestigious museums, the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Hermitage. He offered the collection at a low price, but with two non-negotiable conditions. The museums must buy everything, and the collection must be permanently displayed under his name. All three museums, however, were only interested in selecting the finest pieces individually and refused his demand for a named connection. Then, with the help of a mining magnate friend, Cesnola made contact with John Taylor Johnston, a real-world tycoon and the founding chairman of the board of the newly established Metropolitan Museum of Art. After 4 years' preparation, the Met still faced a fundamental problem. It had almost no exhibits to display and had not yet opened its doors to the public. It was not until the end of 1870 that the museum acquired its first artifact, a Roman sarcophagus donated by another U.S. diplomat stationed in the Ottoman Empire. Cesnola's offer of a large, thematically cohesive collection at a reasonable price was thus a godsend for the fledgling but ambitious Met. After intense negotiations, the two sides reached a deal. The museum would purchase over 7,000 of the remaining 12,000 artifacts from Cesnola for $50,000, payable in 3 annual installments. Additionally, the Met hired Cesnola as its first director as a monthly salary of $500, tasking him with the preservation, restoration, and exhibition of the collection. To mark the occasion, Charles Tiffany, whose founder was also a Met board member, was authorized to produce a series of one-by-one replicas of the artifacts. These replicas would later be acquired by several museums, including British Museum. With this transaction, the Korean artifacts, their dubious origins conveniently swept under the rug, formed the centerpiece of the Met's first public exhibition, occupying more than half of the museum's display space. To this day, these artifacts, along with other Cesnola looted during subsequent trips to Cyprus, are still exhibited at the Met at the Cesnola collection. One board member and his son played a pivotal role in this deal. The father led a team to London to inspect the entire collection before purchase, and together, father and son provided the majority of the funds to acquire the artifacts. The father's name was Julius Spencer Morgan. The son was the legendary J.P. Morgan. In the second half of the 19th century, Morgan was involved in the founding of both the American Museum of Natural History and the Metropolitan Opera, later becoming one of the Met's first members. In 1888, at the repeated invitation and urging of Cesnola and other board members, Morgan resigned from the board of American Museums of Natural History and joined the Met's board, following in his father's footsteps. In 1904, he was elected chairman of the board by unanimous vote. As a preeminent financial tycoon, Morgan spent much of his time living in London, then the world's financial capital and its largest black market for antiquities. One day in the summer of 1904, a cardinal of Roman Catholic Church visited the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum. As he walked past a Catholic vestment on display, he froze. He recognized it immediately. It was the very same vestment stolen 2 years early from a church in Ascoli, a central city in Italy, a relic gifted to the church over 600 years prior by the Pope Nicholas IV, a native of Ascoli. Upon inquiry, the cardinal learned that the vestment was part of J.P. Morgan's private collection, loaned to the museum for exhibition. Soon after, a team of Italian prosecutors boarded Morgan's private yacht, the Corsair, anchored off the coast of Sicily. They had arrested a photographer in London who had been involved in the sale of the vestment and hoped Morgan would cooperate with their investigation by providing details about how he had acquired the relic. Morgan reacted with outrage at the prosecutor's arrival, repeatedly claiming that his connection was so vast he could not possibly remember how he had come into possession of the vestment. In the meantime, several priests involved in the theft were also arrested. In September, the Italian ambassador to London lodged an official protest with Morgan's London representatives demanding the return of the vestment. The representatives responded that Morgan was unavailable to discuss the matter. With diplomatic efforts stalled, the Italian government launched a high-profile public fundraising campaign in October, urging citizens to donate money to buy the vestment back from Morgan. This move sparked the widespread public outrage in Italy. An Italian architect and a cultural heritage restorer published an article in London's The Times, arguing that displaying the stolen vestment in a museum amounted to an endorsement of the theft. He suggested it should instead be placed in Wax Museum on Baker Street to serve as a permanent reminder that buying stolen goods is a shameful act. After his personal letters to Morgan went unanswered, the Bishop of Ascoli, who also served as the city's mayor, wrote to the Pope, pleading with him to use his influence to pressure Morgan into returning the vestment. Finally, in early November, through the intermediation of the Italian ambassador to London and Thessalonica, the vestment was returned to Italy. The Italian foreign minister publicly thanked Morgan for his generosity. King Victor hosted a banquet in his honor and bestowed upon him the Order of the Crown of Italy. The mayor of Ascoli named him an honorary citizen, and the Pope granted him a private audience. The Anglo-American press covered the story extensively, with the New York Times showering Morgan with praise, hailing him as the generous Mr. Morgan. Thanks to this media blitz, Morgan was cemented in the public imagination as a great philanthropist. On the other side of the Atlantic, however, a darker story unfolded. On August 29, 1904, 2 months before Morgan donated the vestment back to Italy, a photographer arrested for his role in the sale hanged himself with a bedsheet from a doorknob just 12 days after being imprisoned. Before his death, he scrawled a message on a piece of paper with a bird matchstick. I'm innocent, but when you find the real culprit, you will discover you cannot touch him. According to Italian media reports, by 1907, all individuals implicated in the vestment theft case had been acquitted due to lack of evidence. Today, the vestment is on display at the Civic Museum of Ascoli. In its exhibit description, the museum merely states, made in England in the 13th century, gifted to Ascoli Cathedral by Pope Nicholas IV in 1288. It makes no mention whatsoever of the dramatic theft of the vestment and the recovery in the early 20th century. This fortunate vestment is the only artifact among the countless antiquities Morgan acquired through questionable means that was ever returned to its rightful owner. During his 10-year tenure as chairman of the Met, Morgan, operating through the black markets of London and Paris, purchased a staggering number of artifacts in both his personal capacity and on behalf of the museum. Many of the antiquities that countries like Italy, Turkey, France, and Egypt have sought to recover from the Met in recent years trace their provenance back to the Morgan area. Nearly all of these items are listed in the museum's records as their donations or purchases. Yet beneath this seemingly unimpeachable paper trail lies a web of illegal transactions, stolen goods, and smuggling. One of the Met's most famous holdings, the Etruscan chariot, was alleged to have been secretly smuggled out of Italy, hidden in a coffin, after a deal was struck between Italian antiquities traffickers and the museum. In his later years, in the late 1910s, Morgan began making plans to ship his vast international collection back to the United States. Under the US tariff laws of the time, Morgan would have been required to pay approximately $1.5 million in import duties equivalent to over 40 million today, to bring all his artifacts into the country. He informed the Met's board of the directors that he was more than willing to donate his collection to the museum, but he would not pay a single cent in customs duties. This was not just Morgan's problem. Thanks to high tariffs, countless artworks and antiquities purchased by wealthy Americans overseas, as well as looted artifacts sourced by traffickers from around the world, were stranded abroad. If this situation persisted, it would severely hamper the Met's efforts to build its connection, and smuggling large quantity of artifacts into the country, as had been done with the Etruscan cherry, was no longer a viable option. In February 1909, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a close ally of America's wealthiest magnates, known as the Voice of the Rich, spearheaded the introduction of the Penn-Aldrich Tariff Act to Congress. This sweeping legislation, which adjusts the tariff on over 2,000 items, was the product of intense lobbying by various industry interest groups, including those representing the art and antiquities trade, to ensure the passage of the bill's provisions related to art and antiquities. Aldrich, merely the public face of the effort, relied on the behind-the-scenes support of another Met board member, Senator Elihu Root of New York. Root held another crucial title. He had just stepped down as U.S. Secretary of the State in January. The president during his tenure was Theodore Roosevelt, a staunch ally of J.P. Morgan. The two men had a gentleman's agreement. As long as Roosevelt was in the White House, Morgan's U.S. Steel Corporation would be immune from antitrust investigations and free to engage in unrestricted mergers and acquisitions. Furthermore, Nelson Aldrich was related by marriage to the richest man in the world, John D. Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil. Aldrich's daughter, Abby, was married to J.D. Rockefeller Jr., the Met's single largest financial benefactor. The Rockefeller Jr. preferred to avoid spotlight and didn't join the board of the museum. His and Abby's massive donations of both art and cash made him the actually greatest power behind the Met, wielding near total control over the board as an outsider. Later, Rockefeller Jr.'s son, Nelson Rockefeller, a billionaire and future U.S. vice president, joined the Met board after retiring from politics. Defying fierce controversy and breaking with Western tradition, he pushed to include his son, Michael's collection of African, Oceanic, and Native American art in Met's permanent exhibits, establishing a dedicated gallery for these works. This made the Met the only major Western museum to display so-called primitive art on equal footing with both Western painting and sculpture, a very radical move at the time, made to honor Michael, who had dedicated his life to studying indigenous art and to help America to strengthen the diplomatic ties with Latin American nations. The Rockefeller family maintained control over the Met well into the 1980s, appointing their family financial advisor, J. Richardson Dilworth, to serve as board chairman. Thanks to the combined lobbying efforts of these capitalists and politicians, the Penn-Aldrich Tariff Act was passed by Congress in August. Tariffs on various industries were raised or lowered, but most artworks and antiquities designated for museum connections were granted duty-free status. Within just 5 months of the bill's passage, over 50 million worth of artifacts, equivalent to 1.5 billion today, flooded into the United States. Morgan, however, did not join his rush. Over the next 2 years, with the assistance of U.S. Customs officials, Treasury Department agents, and staff dispatched by the Met, his European connections were carefully packed and shipped to London. There, a shipping company owned by Morgan was in the process of building a state-of-the-art ocean liner. Scheduled to make its maiden voyage in early 1912, Morgan planned to sail back to the United States aboard this vessel, touted as unsinkable, accompanied by his precious connection. The ship's name was Titanic. The rest, as they say, is history. As the owner of the shipping line, Morgan ultimately avoided the disaster by canceling his voyage at the last minute. He had received word that the French government was planning to revise its laws to prohibit the export of artifacts to American buyers, and a significant portion of his collection was still stored in Paris, the world's second largest black market for antiquities after London. He rushed to Paris to retrieve his treasures before the new regulation took effect. In the decades that followed, Driven by America's wealthy elites, Manhattan emerged as the world's third largest black market for antiquities after London and Paris. Countless masterpieces flowed into the city's museums. In 1970, UNESCO signed a convention requiring all signatory nations to ensure that museum collections were legally acquired. Any artifact proven to have been stolen or smuggled was to be returned to its country of origin. The artifacts that have flooded into the United States, however, all came with similarly legitimate provenance documents attesting their legal acquisition. Even the Dunhuang murals, infamously looted by Harvard professor Landon Warner, for which the director of Dunhuang Academy, Fan Jinshi, had demanded their return, are claimed by Harvard's Folk Museum to have been legally purchased, with the museum even producing a receipt as proof. In a country with more lawyers than any other in the world, proving one's innocence is a relatively straightforward affair. If all else fails, one can simply feign ignorance. For example, the Met's exhibit labels for the Buddhist heads and fragments looted from the Longman grottos, including a stone carving of a Buddha head dating to the reign of Emperor Shaowen of Northern Wei, simply state their origin as Longmen, Luoyang, omitting any mention of their illicit journey to New York. As Manhattan grew into the world's third largest city, the Met evolved into one of the finest museums in New York and the world, yet it never became the institution of public aesthetic and artistic education that John Jay had envisioned, not even from the very beginning. Because of its status as a public charity established under New York state law, the Met received substantial support from the city government. The land on which the museum now stands, 1000 Fifth Avenue, on the eastern edge of Central Park, was provided free of charge by the city. The city also contributed funds to the museum's numerous renovations and expansions. By customs, every mayor of New York and head of the city's cultural affairs department automatically serve as an ex-official member of the Met's Board of Trustees. In exchange, the city requires the Met to fulfill a certain public education mission. But over a century ago, America's working class labored at least 6 days a week, with only Sundays off, a day of rest in the Catholic faith, known as the Sabbath. Since most of the Met's board members were Catholic, the museum was closed to the public on Sundays during its early years. As a result, for much of the time, the Met had few ordinary visitors and functioned more like a private club and a drawing room for its wealthy board members. The Met's first director, Cesnola, publicly declared on more than one occasion, "It is difficult to imagine what the museum's grand hall would look like, filled with working-class people." He emphasized that the Met was a private institution, free to set its own hours of operation. Of course, under mounting pressure from the New York City government and public opinion, the Met eventually began opening its doors to the public 7 days a week. But its elite, exclusive DNA remained unchanged. To sit at the same table as figures like Henry Kissinger and Anna Wintour, one must either possess a resume and the social status that can bring unparalleled resources, like Kissinger and Wintour themselves, or be able to afford a board membership, a position that costs tens of millions of dollars, a price tag unmatched by any other institution in New York. For example, in 2010, New York socialite Ann Ziff donated $30 million to the Metropolitan Opera, becoming the largest donor in the opera's history. In recognition, the Met Opera immediately named her its next board chairman at the Met Museum. However, that same $30 million donation would only secure her a spot as one of the museum's 40-something board members. It's no surprise that the Met's board of directors had become New York's most exclusive social circle, a super board of the ultra-wealthy and powerful. With its elite board and vast financial resources, the Met has established itself as one of the world's preeminent art museums, rivaling even the Louvre. It's comprehensive and unparalleled, spanning ancient Greece, Rome, Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Egypt. The holdings of nearly every department at the Met rank among the finest in the world. Its Egyptian connection is comparable to that of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Its collection of Chinese paintings and porcelain is on par with the Palace Museum in Beijing. The Costume Institute, under the leadership of Anna Wintour, is the Met's crown jewel. Its annual fundraising gala, the Met Gala, known as the Oscars of fashion, and blockbuster exhibitions like Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty, and Schiaparelli and Prada. Impossible Conversations consistently win both critical acclaim and record-breaking attendance. The Met Gala is held annually in the museum's Charles Engelhard Court, a space that is available for recent year, run for weddings, birthday parties, or corporate events. The only requirement? Donating enough money to attend the corresponding membership level, plus paying the venue rental fee. For instance, Chanel chose to debut its 2018 Egyptian-themed collection directly in front of the Met's Temple of Dender, an act of unparalleled prestige. Most other exhibition halls at the Met, including those housing European sculpture and American art, are also available for rental, provided the artifacts on display do not have specific requirements for light, humidity, or other preservation conditions. Thus, when the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which houses national treasures like the Yixin Liao Dynasty trial-colored Luohan statues, and two of the famous Six Deeds of Zhao mausoleum, converted its Chinese gallery into a wedding venue a few years ago. Some people decried it as cultural disrespect, but in reality, there was no disrespect intended. This is simply their culture. To Americans, these artifacts are ultimately nothing more than decorative objects, social tools for the wealthy to flaunt their wealth and taste, the profound cultural heritage they embody, and the sense of reverence for history that people in the East hold dear, are entirely absent in this mindset. For Americans, the most innovative people on the planet, history is meant to be challenged and overturned. So when I listen to the curator of the Met's Asian art department expound eloquently on how to appreciate Chinese paintings, I know he's undoubtedly knowledgeable, but something always feels missing. There is a fundamental disconnect between Eastern and the Western attitudes toward history, antiquities, and the roles of museums. It is impossible to say definitively which approach is right or wrong, for at present, the influence wielded by American museums like the Met far exceeds that of museums in our own country.